Hello there, wonderful people. Hope you guys have all been doing well. Today, we find ourselves in some unfamiliar sights.
What?
On BNSF trackage. And if you're asking how I found myself on BNSF trackage, I frankly have no idea.
Bruh.
I kind of just drove out after church and wanted to see whatever I could find. And just my luck, I would actually happen to find a train.
Nice.
BNSF Z-AUG SBD. The Z indicating high priority intermodal, AUG for Austell, Georgia, which has one of the intermodal terminals that this train will work, and SBD for the final destination of this train, San Bernardino, California.
Wow.
I know, quite the journey. And looking at the signal bridge up top, we can see a clue as to why this train is parked here. There is another train that is lined on the track adjacent to it. So all I could do was wait until I would eventually hear a rumble and would expect to see some BNSF units rounding the curve down there.
Wait a minute.
Over there.
Instead, we have Norfolk Southern. Why? Because I've lied to all of y'all.
He's a liar.
For those of you who live on this line, you were probably very confused as to why I was saying I was in foreign territory. I'm literally in Sugar Hill, like 2 minutes away from Beaufort, Georgia. The train behind us is Norfolk Southern 283, and the train approaching us is Norfolk Southern 282, part of the regularly scheduled slate of afternoon intermodals that run on the Norfolk Southern Greenville District. Now, some of you may be asking why on earth I tried pawning off the Greenville District as some BNSF line.
Wow.
Well, that's because if you did not know this line and didn't know this area, you would have seen those 4 units and have no idea that this is a Norfolk Southern line. And this does beg the question, how is it that there is a Norfolk Southern train on Norfolk Southern trackage that has 0 Norfolk Southern units on it? Well, this train is a prime example of something called foreign power.
What is that?
You see, my friends, across the United States, railroads have their own set of trackage that they own. They're responsible for maintaining it, and they use these specific rails to run their trains over their area. However, every so often, on some lines more than others, you will see locomotives from outside railroads. In this case, we're on a Norfolk Southern main line, but we're seeing a train exclusively being led by BNSF Power, even though this is a Norfolk Southern train. In these instances of one railroad's locomotives being used to power another railroad's trains on their trackage is known as foreign power. Now, the practice of railroads sharing locomotive power has existed for as long as railroads have been around, but it wasn't nearly as prevalent in the past as it is now. And one of the reasons for that has to do with steam locomotives.
What do you mean by that?
For those of you who are more railroad enthusiasts, have you ever noticed that when people mention steam models, they always attach the railroad name behind it? They'd be like the Southern Mikado, or the Reading T1, or the Union Pacific Big Boy. Top tier gatekeeping. Whereas with modern diesel locomotives, people usually attach the manufacturer behind the locomotive. The General Electric or GE ES44AC, the EMD SD70 ACE. What these semantics show is that locomotives today are a lot more standardized than their steam counterparts in the past, which means it is much easier to share diesel locomotives compared to steam locomotives because a diesel locomotive on one railroad is pretty much identical to a diesel locomotive on another railroad, besides some pretty negligible modifications between models, such as maybe the weight or a few electronic modifications. Overall, when it comes to the majority of the locomotive and the parts that go into it, it's pretty much universal. So if a locomotive gets shared onto another railroad and they need to do some maintenance on it, the railroad that's using that shared locomotive will have the parts necessary in order to do the necessary maintenance because they pretty much have the same locomotive, which is a very big contrast to steam, where the locomotive models vary heavily and very often they are very specific to a given railroad. So if a railroad were to share a steam locomotive and some parts were needed for maintenance or something like that, the railroad using the shared steam locomotive may not have all the parts needed for the repairs and may need to tow back the locomotive back to its original owner or get the parts shipped or just a lot of extra stuff that you wouldn't have with diesel locomotives. Another reason that you may see foreign power on your rail line is because of run-through agreements. And run-through agreements occur when another railroad is actually running their train on a different railroad's trackage, which is different from the practice of sharing locomotives. For instance, take this coal train. This is a CSX coal train running on Norfolk Southern trackage. This isn't like it's a Norfolk Southern train that's using CSX power. This train is being led by a CSX crew with CSX power, but it's on Norfolk Southern trackage. And the reason that they have this run-through agreement is just because it's easier and more cost-efficient for both companies to share the trackage rather than having the other company go on an extended, more costly route. Another reason that you might see foreign power is because of leasing. Sometimes railroads may not have enough locomotive power to meet the demands of their customers. Could be because traffic has gone up, maybe because the railroad has a lot of locomotives set aside in storage for maintenance or rebuilding or whatever, so they may need to buy some power temporarily from a leasing source so they at least have something to move their trains. Norfolk Southern as of late has been rather notorious for this, especially around 2015. That was a different era of railroading. But even recently, there were a lot of ex-BNSF and current Wells Fargo Max that Norfolk Southern had on lease, and in addition to that, there were also a bunch of former CEFX leaser AC-44s that Norfolk Southern actually bought that will eventually be used for the Norfolk Southern DC to AC rebuild program. However, in most cases, when you see foreign power on a train, it's just because the railroads are sharing the locomotives. Meaning, if you're on a Norfolk Southern line and you see Union Pacific Power leading the train, this is a Norfolk Southern train with a Norfolk Southern crew, but it has Union Pacific Power that's being shared. And this often happens just because it's much easier for the railroad to just keep the locomotive on and minimize dwell time. Like I said, it's basically the same locomotive between different railroads, so you might as well just keep using the same power instead of lengthening the journey by trying to switch out locomotives so that it matches the railroad. Some trains is pretty random. It's kind of just by chance that you might find a certain random railroad on a certain train. But other trains, it's kind of scheduled and expected to see another railroad leading the train. Like the train that we saw parked here in the beginning with the 4 BNSF locomotives. Like I said before, this is BNSF Z-AUG SBD. And like I mentioned before, this train terminates in San Bernardino, California. There's also another counterpart that originates in San Bernardino, California and terminates on the East Coast. And because it's BNSF power that will have to go onto the East Coast and then return back to the West Coast, there's no point in switching the power. So you might as well just run the BNSF power through and send it back, which is exactly what happens with this train. This isn't a run through though, because this is actually a Norfolk Southern crew that is on this train.
Good evening.
And this interchange occurs in Memphis, Tennessee. Because both Norfolk Southern and BNSF have a presence there. BNSF has a huge intermodal facility there, so it's just a good spot for the railroads to switch, so that the Norfolk Southern crew can take whatever East Coast traffic is on the train and deliver it to the customers in North Carolina and Georgia and wherever else this train works on its journey. A similar example of this is Norfolk Southern 28J, which is Union Pacific ZLAAI. This train, as you could guess, originates on Union Pacific trackage, so almost every single time that you see it with Union Pacific power. And this train actually works in Atlanta, Georgia, and continues all the way down to Jacksonville, but because there is an outbound intermodal train that comes out of Atlanta and terminates on Union Pacific trackage, they usually take off the power in Atlanta, replace it with Norfolk Southern power, and then send the UP power back to Union Pacific. This does beg the question though, how exactly do the railroads keep track of this? Well, the railroads keep track of foreign power with a metric called horsepower hours, which is basically a quantity that measures the horsepower of the locomotive that's being used and the time that that locomotive is being used on another railroad, which is a pretty logical metric because if you're a railroad and you're renting out a 4,300 horsepower SD70 ACE versus a 3,000 horsepower SD40-2, you shouldn't really be paying as much for the SD40-2 as you should be for the SD70 ACE, just because you're getting more power output from one locomotive versus the other. And there's a rate that's attached to the horsepower hours, and the railroads have all the info on what foreign power locomotive may be on their trackage and the cost that's associated with it and how long it's been there. And this cost can either be repaid by just paying up the fee or by the railroad in turn giving up one of their own locomotives to the railroad that's sharing some of their power. So if you're on Norfolk Southern trackage and you see a random train with Union Pacific power, the railroad is either going to just pay up the fee that's associated with using that power for how many hours it was on Norfolk Southern trackage, or Norfolk Southern will in turn give a motor to Union Pacific for them to use for one of their trains. When a railroad is using forward power, there are certain responsibilities that each railroad has in terms of who pays for what. If a railroad is using foreign power and all of a sudden it needs maintenance, that maintenance usually gets billed to the original owner of that unit, because it doesn't make sense for a railroad to receive a pretty beat up engine and then be forced to pay for the maintenance that wasn't even their fault. With that being said, however, in the case of incidents such as derailments and such, that's sort of on a case-by-case basis. It can be either good or bad for the railroad that's using the foreign power.
What are you talking about?
Take for instance this motor.
Oh, I'm hurt!
This is Union Pacific 6052, a General Electric AC44 unit that derailed in a washout derailment a few months before. This This unit derailed on Norfolk Southern trackage, and evidently it was determined that Norfolk Southern would have to pay for the damages. Because this unit is not on its way to get returned to Union Pacific, it was actually on its way up to Altoona for a complete overhaul of all the damage that it incurred in the derailment, before it will eventually get put back onto Union Pacific trackage. Which is kind of an L for Norfolk Southern, because they have to spend all the money on repairing this unit, and at the end of the day, they don't even get to keep it. They still got to give it back. If you see a lot of foreign power in your area, in my experience, it could be indicative of two things. Either one, there was a lot of run-through traffic, either intermodals or bulk traffic that has to go through your area that originates from outside railroads. Or two, your railroad is very power short, and they need any power that they can get. I have definitely seen on Norfolk Southern many instances of them just having no power, and a lot of trains that usually would have had strict Norfolk Southern power suddenly having power from Canadian railroads, Union Pacific, BNSF, whatever, just because they needed anything that they could get their hands on to be moving their trains.
What is this?
I know us rail fans like seeing foreign power a lot. It's cool seeing different railroads that I wouldn't normally be able to see in my home area, and it just makes for a more colorful time trackside. But from an economic perspective of the railroad, I would think they would preferably not always have foreign power, especially if they don't have power to in turn give to the other railroad that they're taking power from, because at the end of the day, they are incurring a cost by using another railroad's motors to run their own trains. So usually when you see foreign power, there is usually a cycle that the power takes for it to come up and come back in the direction of where the original owner is from. Such is the case with this train here. It's a week later and we're currently in Buford, Georgia, and off in the distance is Norfolk Southern 242. And this train right now is being led by two Union Pacific motors, a GE AC44 and an EMD ST70 ACE. So this is 8,800 foreign horsepower that Norfolk Southern is paying a rate for every hour that's being used to run their trains. And so to ensure that this power doesn't get lost in the railroad and the railroad isn't just incurring a cost, this train, which is going north right now, will return south on Norfolk Southern 243 with the exact same power as it heads toward Atlanta, and then that power from Atlanta will eventually make its way back into Union Pacific trackage. Our sightings of foreign power wouldn't end for the day because there is one more train for us to see. Like I said before, when 242 goes up, it will always come back down, usually 2 days later with the same power. And such was the case with this Norfolk Southern 243 lash-up, with a Norfolk Southern SD70 ACC on the front and a Union Pacific SD70 Ace trailing second.
Incredible.
Union Pacific Ace that was originally leading up, but is now trailing as they're coming back down south. And this foreign motor here will eventually find its way on a train that will eventually take it back to its home rails of Union Pacific trackage. But as for now, it is here, powering a Norfolk Southern train, incurring a cost for the railroad, but at least giving me something to enjoy as I'm out trackside. Well, my friends, that's all I have to say on the subject of foreign power. An example of the railroads working together to share each other's assets to make sure that freight and goods get to where they need to get to at the lowest cost for everyone. If you guys have any more information or you think I missed anything, feel free to share it down below. Until next time, God bless. I will see you soon out on the high iron.